The mansion was eerily quiet, a fortress of cold marble and polished steel. Yet inside, Leo McPherson's world was collapsing. He sat in the corner of the private nursery, hands clasped tightly together, staring at the 4 incubators lined up like fragile glass prisons. Beeping monitors marked each baby's fight against life, a rhythm that felt like a taunting heartbeat. He had spent years building empires, acquiring power, bending the world to his will. But here in the sterile light of this room, he was powerless. Each tiny chest rising and falling reminded him of what he could not control, what no amount of money could buy. Time, health, safety. Leo's jaw was clenched so tightly that the veins along his temple throbbed visibly. He didn't notice the trembling of his hands, the sharp taste of his own panic. Doctors came and went with precise movements, discussing vitals and oxygen saturation in tones too clinical to carry warmth, too detached to mask the weight of the situation. He nodded mechanically at their reports, the words barely registering. He hated feeling like this. Vulnerable. Helpless. Meanwhile, in another part of the mansion, Rita adjusted the uniform that had been handed to her that morning. The crisp fabric smelled faintly of starch and disinfectant, but beneath it, she carried her own invisible weight. At 26, she had learned early that the world didn't notice people like her. She had grown up in small apartments, working every odd job she could find, scraping together the life she had now. But this mansion, gleaming, intimidating, and suffocating, felt like a universe apart from her own. And yet, beneath her apprehension, something in her stirred. She was not here by chance. Something about this household demanded courage she had almost forgotten she possessed. She walked down the hallway to the nursery, feeling the soft click of polished floors under her shoes. She had been instructed to remain in the background, to observe, to anticipate needs she didn't yet understand. She entered the room quietly, taking in the monitors, the incubators, the single father who looked like he had aged a decade in the past few hours. Leo's head snapped up at the sound of the door, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers for a brief, unreadable moment. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. Who was this young woman, daring to enter unannounced? I'm here to help, she said softly, her voice almost swallowed by the hum of the machines. Leo's lips pressed into a thin line. Help, he repeated almost bitterly. Do you even know what you're walking into? Rita hesitated, heart hammering. She knew she was just a maid. She didn't have the medical expertise. But she had something else. A presence, a steadiness born from surviving chaos in her own life. I can try, she said simply, her hands tightening at her sides. There was no bravado in her words, only sincerity. Leo looked back down at the babies, each chest rising and falling with uncertain rhythm. He hated himself for the flicker of hope he felt at her willingness. He hated that he wanted someone to step into this disaster, to fight alongside him. And yet, here she was, small and vulnerable, standing with a courage he hadn't anticipated. Hours passed like this, the room filled with tension that was almost physical. Leo's gaze never left the monitors, but he found himself noticing her small actions. The way she adjusted the tiny blankets, the quiet hum of her voice as she whispered encouragements to the infants. He didn't speak, didn't respond, but something inside him stirred. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, he felt the weight of his isolation lift ever so slightly. Rita, in turn, felt the oppressive atmosphere of the mansion's power begin to soften. Leo's presence was intimidating, yes, but also profoundly human in his desperation. She had seen fear before, she had lived it, but seeing it in someone who seemed untouchable made her heart ache. She wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but she was careful. She didn't want to be dismissed, didn't want to be ignored. She wanted to matter here, in this room of fragile life. The afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting elongated shadows across the polished floor. Time became fluid. Rita checked the machines again, whispering soft reassurances to the babies, while Leo's hands twitched, fingers curling into fists as he whispered silent prayers he hadn't uttered since childhood. He had controlled empires, but he could not control this. The gravity of his helplessness was crushing. And yet, watching her, this seemingly insignificant presence, he felt something shift. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was a recognition that life sometimes required courage no wealth could buy. A sudden alarm blared from the monitor of the smallest infant. Instinctively, Leo shot to his feet, his chest tightening. Rita moved faster than she knew she could, her hand steady despite her pounding heart. She adjusted the machine, rubbed the infant's tiny back, whispered soothing words he could barely hear. Leo felt the weight of shock, relief, and awe collide in a whirlwind. He hadn't expected her to act like this. She had done something small but monumental, something he had been paralyzed to do himself. For a brief, suspended moment, the room was quiet again. Leo's eyes met Rita's and neither spoke. Words would have ruined it. It was an understanding beyond dialogue, a recognition of courage, of empathy, of an unspoken alliance forming in the midst of despair. Neither knew yet how this fragile connection would evolve, but both felt it, sharp and undeniable. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the room in soft orange hues, Leo finally allowed himself to breathe. Not fully, not completely, but enough to notice Rita moving quietly around the nursery, her presence a subtle promise that maybe, just maybe, they were not entirely alone in this fight. And as he watched her work, he realized something he hadn't admitted to anyone in years. He wanted her to stay. And in that suspended, quiet moment, a seed was planted. The kind of seed that, if nurtured, could grow into something powerful, something neither of them had expected. Outside, the world continued, indifferent and bustling, but inside the mansion, time slowed. The heartbeat of the quadruplets, the soft movements of the maid, the tense vigilance of the billionaire, they were all caught in the same fragile thread of hope. And in that thread lay the first hint of a connection that could change everything. The room was tense with the quiet hum of machines, but tension was about to erupt into chaos. Leo McPherson's gaze was locked on the monitor in front of him, eyes wide as the smallest of his quadruplets' vitals began to falter. His fists tightened, knuckles white, and a shiver ran through his spine. He had faced boardroom collapses, hostile takeovers, and billion-dollar losses without breaking a sweat, but nothing in his life had prepared him for this. The helplessness of watching a tiny human fight for every breath. Heart rate dropping, oxygen saturation critical. The nurse shouted, her voice clipped, professional, yet threaded with panic. Leo's world narrowed. He pushed past the other staff, moving closer to the incubator. Do something, he barked, voice rough and brittle, though he felt his own throat tightening. Panic clawed at him, raw and consuming. He had money, influence, everything, but now in this sterile fluorescent-lit room, he had nothing. Rita was there before he even realized it. Instinct, courage, or perhaps some reckless bravery she didn't fully understand propelled her forward. She knelt by the incubator, eyes scanning the monitors, hands moving with astonishing precision, though she had no formal medical training. It was as if every instinct she had ever developed in a life of survival had been waiting for this moment. Leo froze. What are you doing?" he asked, voice sharp with disbelief, but beneath it, a flicker of awe. "Helping," Rita said softly, almost a whisper. Her hands adjusted the tiny tubes and sensors, gentle yet deliberate. She murmured reassuring words to the infant, her voice a fragile tether connecting the baby to life itself. "Shoo, it's okay, little one. You've got this." For a heartbeat, Leo wanted to intervene, to take over, but he realized he couldn't. He had no idea how to fix this. His pride, his usual need to control, faltered under the weight of helplessness. And then, almost imperceptibly, he saw something else. The baby responded. The tiny chest, once fluttering perilously, began to rise more steadily. A whisper of relief rippled through him. The nurses looked at her in stunned silence. The doctors exchanged incredulous glances. Leo's chest tightened, an unfamiliar sensation settling in. Not control, not fear, but awe. Someone with no claim to authority here, had stepped into the impossible. And it had worked. Time seemed to stretch, elongated by every pulse, every shallow breath, every fluttering heartbeat of the fragile lives around them. Leo's mind raced, heart pounding in rhythm with the monitors. He had money, power, legions of staff, but he had never felt such helplessness, nor such unexpected relief. And he knew deep down that this moment would change him. "Keep talking to him," Leo found himself saying, almost against his own disbelief. His voice was rough, hesitant, foreign to him. He had never asked anyone to keep talking before. Not to a person, certainly not to a baby. But in that moment he realized that connection, human connection, was what mattered most. Rita's eyes flicked toward him. For a brief instant, a spark of recognition passed between them, as if she understood that he too was learning a lesson he didn't yet have words for. She nodded slightly, continuing her gentle ministrations. The room, filled with blinking monitors and clinical efficiency, seemed suddenly warmer. The crisis passed slowly, agonizingly. The baby stabilized, monitors flatlining into steady, comforting beeps. Leo sank into the chair nearby, head and hands shaking. Relief, fear, exhaustion, and gratitude collided inside him. He felt raw, exposed, human. He had not expected anyone, least of all a maid, to be the one to save what he cherished most. Rita sat back on her heels, breathing shallow but steady. She looked at the baby, then at Leo, and in that gaze, something unspoken passed between them. No words were necessary. Courage had met desperation. Compassion had met fear. And for the first time since the babies had been born, there was a flicker of hope. Leo finally looked up. You did that," he said, voice low, almost reverent. He struggled to find the right words. I don't know how to thank you." Rita shook her head, faint blush rising across her cheeks. "Just do what you're supposed to. Keep them safe. That's enough." Her voice was quiet, but the strength beneath it was unmistakable. She had risked everything in that moment, her confidence, her own fear, and yet she said it was enough. For the first time, Leo noticed the tremor in her hands, the quickened heartbeat he could almost hear in the silence. She was brave, yes, but human too. The realization was almost dizzying. He had been so consumed with control, with power, that he had never paused to see the courage of someone so unassuming, so seemingly insignificant, could move mountains. Minutes passed, and the room slowly returned to routine. Machines beeped in steady rhythm. Nurses and doctors murmured reassurances, but Leo's mind remained on her, on Rita. The way she had acted without hesitation. The calm precision that belied her position. The quiet humanity she had brought to a sterile room filled with fear. He didn't want to admit it, but he felt something stir inside him. The beginnings of gratitude, yes, but also a fragile spark of admiration. Maybe even something like respect. And then, without warning, the weight of everything hit him again. For fragile lives, each one tethered to the edge of possibility. He had been so focused on this one crisis that he almost forgot the others. His chest tightened once more, panic threatening to rise again. But he didn't move immediately. He watched carefully, and then almost instinctively, Rita shifted to the next incubator, repeating the delicate, miraculous care she had shown moments ago. Leo's voice caught in his throat. How are you doing this?" he asked, almost a whisper. Rita looked up, eyes steady, voice calm. "Because I have to," she said simply. There was no drama, no arrogance, only certainty. She had chosen this moment to act, to risk, to be everything the room needed. And in that certainty, Leo felt something he had long buried. Hope. For the first time since the baby's birth, he allowed himself to breathe fully, to feel, to recognize that life could still be saved, not through money, not through power, but through courage and heart. And in that recognition, he felt a pull toward her, an unspoken acknowledgement that something profound was beginning between them. The evening settled over the mansion, the room bathed in warm golden light from the setting sun. Leo remained seated, fingers interlaced, eyes fixed on the monitors. Rita stood quietly, attending to each baby with the same care and diligence. They were both exhausted, but neither noticed. They were caught in the aftershock of a miracle, a moment of shared humanity that neither of them had anticipated. Somewhere in the quiet, invisible threads began to tie them together. Not words, not promises, not declarations, just a recognition of bravery, compassion, and vulnerability shared in the most impossible of circumstances. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Leo realized something he had never admitted to anyone before. He wanted her here. Not as a maid, not as an observer, but as someone he could trust, someone whose courage he could rely on, someone whose heart had, in one extraordinary moment, changed everything. And Rita, without speaking a single word, understood. She had acted on instinct, yes, but she had also connected with something in him that was raw, frightened, and human. They did not yet know each other, but something had shifted irrevocably. Hope had arrived in the form of a quiet, fearless presence. And for both of them, it would be impossible to ignore. The days after the crisis passed in a blur of routine, but the emotional weight lingered like a shadow. Leo McPherson sat in the same nursery, posture rigid, eyes flicking to each monitor with a blend of vigilance and denial. He had survived corporate battles, media scandals, and betrayals, but here in the delicate world of his quadruplets, every heartbeat was a reminder of his vulnerability. He had allowed himself to feel hope once, had allowed it to connect him to someone, Rita, but now the fear of losing control threatened to shut him down entirely. Rita moved silently through the room, attending to the babies with careful hands, her presence steady yet unassuming. She had hoped the unspoken bond that had formed during the crisis would create trust, warmth, and perhaps collaboration, but she sensed the resistance in Leo. He kept his distance, watched her work, but spoke rarely, his gratitude compressed into curt nods or strained silence. "You don't have to hover over them all the time," Rita said gently one afternoon, adjusting a tiny blanket around the smallest infant. Her voice carried no accusation, only soft observation. Leo's eyes flicked to her, tension in every line of his body. "I can't, not right now," he replied, voice clipped rigid. He hated the way his chest felt tight, hated the flutter of emotion he couldn't control. "I can't trust anyone else yet." Rita froze, subtle hurt flashing across her face before she masked it with professionalism. "I understand," she said softly, bending over the incubator. She didn't press him, didn't challenge him directly. She had learned long ago that confrontation with pride often backfired. Instead, she worked silently, letting the baby's rhythm guide her and the room breathe with careful, quiet patience. The days grew longer. Leo's resistance wasn't just a personal defense, it created friction. Nurses whispered about his anxiety, subtle tension filling the nursery like static. Rita felt the weight of unspoken judgment, but she also understood his world. He had never been powerless before. To let someone else act in his domain, to accept help, was an alien act. Still, she persisted, quietly bridging the distance with gentle words, small gestures, and unwavering care. "Leo, look," she said one afternoon, moving closer as he hovered over the monitors. "The oxygen levels are stabilizing better after the last adjustment." "You don't have to," she stopped mid-sentence, noticing the way he stiffened. His jaw was tight, his eyes a storm of pride and fear. "I know," he said sharply. "I see it. But it doesn't mean anything yet. I can't relax." He turned away, pretending to check another monitor, but avoiding eye contact. Every instinct screamed that he should push her away, assert dominance, protect himself. He couldn't risk attachment, couldn't risk vulnerability. Not now, not ever. Rita sighed softly under her breath, but she didn't retreat. She had faced far worse resistance in her own life, and knew that sometimes the strongest walls required patience, not confrontation. She moved to the next incubator, murmuring encouragements, her eyes occasionally flicking to him, silently reminding him that they were in this together, whether he wanted to admit it or not. Outside the nursery, the mansion seemed indifferent, hallways long and cold, echoing with distant footsteps. Leo's assistants tried to engage him in mundane matters, reports, appointments, and meetings, but he was distracted. His mind was split between the babies, the room, and the enigma of Rita's presence. Her calm courage contrasted sharply with his controlled chaos. The thought unnerved him. He wasn't used to someone acting independently, someone stepping into his life with authority he couldn't dictate. The tension peaked one evening. A nurse approached Leo with a report. "Two of the babies' temperatures dropped suddenly. We need to adjust the incubators immediately." He froze, hands clenching at his sides. "Go check," he barked, unable to look at her directly. Panic rose like fire. Yet he refused to act himself. The nurse hesitated, then left. Rita stepped forward, without hesitation. "I'll handle it," she said calmly. She moved to the incubators, adjusting settings, checking each baby with gentle efficiency. Leo stood behind her, rigid, fists clenched. His pride screamed at him to step in, to take control, but his fear of failure paralyzed him. Watching her act so naturally, so bravely, created a storm inside him. Gratitude, frustration, awe and confusion all collided. You think you can do this better than me?" he demanded finally, voice low and dangerous. Rita didn't flinch. "I'm just helping," she replied softly. "They need steady hands, not panic. You can't save them if you're paralyzed by fear." Leo's chest tightened. Her words cut through the layers of armor he had built over decades. Anger, shame, and fear battled inside him. He had never been told he was failing, not in business, not in life, but here Rita's quiet observation exposed the rawest nerve he had. His vulnerability as a father. He turned away, taking a step back. I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, voice breaking slightly. The confession was almost unbearable. Admitting weakness was alien to him. Rita paused, a hand hovering briefly over the incubator as if to offer comfort, but she held back. "You don't have to do it alone," she said softly. "But you do have to try." Her words landed like a whisper in a storm. Leo's jaw clenched, tears he refused to shed prickling his eyes. Resistance had kept him safe, had kept him in control, but now it felt like a cage, trapping him in fear while the babies' lives depended on action. He wanted to push her away, to shut down the connection that terrified him, but he couldn't ignore the truth. She was right. For hours afterward, Leo hovered silently, watching her work. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to admit everything he felt, but he didn't. He clenched his fists, reminding himself that vulnerability was weakness. Yet the more he tried to resist, the more he realized he couldn't deny the subtle shift in the room. Rita's presence had become a stabilizing force, her courage seeping into him even as he fought it. By nightfall, the crisis had passed once again. The babies slept, monitors beeping a steady rhythm. Leo sat in the corner, exhausted, frustrated, and yet strangely alive. He hadn't reached out, hadn't spoken words of gratitude, but the walls around him were cracking, just slightly. Rita, still attentive, noticed the change. The tension in his shoulders, the sharp lines around his eyes, had softened imperceptibly. She didn't comment, didn't force acknowledgement. She only continued, silently reminding him that sometimes courage was quiet, and sometimes connection was patient. And in that delicate balance, fear, resistance, awe and a growing unspoken bond, the stage was set. Neither of them yet fully understood the depth of what was forming, but both felt its pull. Leo resisted because he feared vulnerability. Rita persisted because she had nothing left to lose and everything to give. The night settled over the mansion, shadows stretching long across polished floors. Outside, the world carried on in ignorance, but inside the nursery, an invisible battle raged. Pride clashed with fear. Hope wrestled with denial. And in that crucible, a connection was being forged, delicate and fragile, but undeniable. Leo finally exhaled, a long shuddering breath, his fists unclenching just enough to let a tiny fragment of trust slip in. He would resist. He would argue. He would wrestle with fear for days to come. But the seed had been planted. Rita had done more than save the babies. She had touched something deep inside him, something he couldn't yet name. And he couldn't escape it even if he tried. And Rita, for all her quiet courage, understood that his resistance was only temporary. She had survived far worse, and she would wait, patient and steady, until he could step forward. Not just as the powerful billionaire, but as a man capable of trust, connection, and love. In the silence of the nursery, the quadruplets slept, their tiny breaths echoing softly against the walls. Leo's gaze lingered on Rita, and though he would never admit it, his heart had shifted, even as his mind resisted. The battle had only just begun. The storm had rolled in unexpectedly that evening, fierce and unrelenting. Rain lashed against the mansion's expansive windows, turning the gardens outside into a blur of gray shadows. Leo McPherson was pacing, tense and impatient. The staff had retreated to secure the estate, leaving only him, Rita, and the 4 fragile lives that had become his sole obsession. Rita moved quietly between the incubators, checking monitors, adjusting tiny blankets, and murmuring soft encouragements to each baby. Leo's eyes followed her, a mixture of irritation and reluctant admiration battling in his chest. He wanted to assert control, to tell her to step back, to let him manage. But the sudden storm, the isolation of the mansion, and the weight of responsibility left him powerless. He had no choice but to remain near her, trapped together in the nursery. "You shouldn't be out in this storm," he said finally, his voice low but tense. He didn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on the baby's monitors. "It's dangerous." Rita glanced up, her expression calm yet firm. "I need to be here. They can't wait for anyone else." Her hands moved confidently, adjusting a tiny oxygen mask. "Besides, I've faced worse than a storm. You of all people should know that sometimes circumstances force us to act, even if it's inconvenient." Leo clenched his jaw. She had a point, of course. He did know. He had faced financial crises that could have destroyed empires and survived betrayals that could have shattered him. Yet this felt different. Vulnerability wasn't just a possibility here, it was mandatory. He couldn't retreat into the walls of his office, couldn't hide behind money or influence. He was forced to be present, forced to watch, forced to acknowledge something he had long denied. His need for connection, for help, for trust. Minutes passed in tense silence. The storm outside intensified, wind rattling the panes, thunder rolling across the hills surrounding the estate. Inside, the nursery was warm and still, the only sound the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the quiet murmur of Rita speaking to the babies. Leo's chest tightened. He hated feeling exposed, hated the way her calm confidence unsettled him. Yet he couldn't tear his gaze from her. Rita noticed his tension but didn't comment. She understood the delicate balance of pride and fear, the invisible walls he had built around himself. She moved closer to him, adjusting a blanket over the smallest infant without asking permission. An act that would have been impossible if he hadn't been forced to remain silent, forced to accept her presence. "Leo," she said softly, not looking at him. "They're stable for now, but you can't do this alone." His lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't respond immediately, letting silence stretch between them. But something in her tone, gentle yet unwavering, struck a chord deep within him. He was used to commanding every situation, used to being in control. Yet here, with the storm raging outside and the weight of the infants' lives pressing down, he had no choice but to listen, to observe, to trust, even if only slightly. The first lightning bolt split the sky, illuminating the nursery in stark, white brilliance. Leo flinched involuntarily, and Rita's hand brushed his shoulder as she adjusted the tiny incubator. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent a jolt through him. A reminder that proximity was no longer optional. They were tethered together, not just by the crisis, but by circumstance. You're impossible," he muttered, voice low, almost a whisper. His pride demanded that he assert dominance, that he push her away. Yet there was something else in his words, unspoken and raw. Admiration, relief, and a hint of something more dangerous, attraction. Rita didn't flinch. "Maybe," she replied softly. "But I think we make a good team when it matters most. You should try it sometime." Her words, light and teasing, were a subtle challenge. Leo felt his defenses shift, slowly, almost imperceptibly. He hated the warmth that crept into his chest, hated the way her presence made the world outside the nursery fade into insignificance. And yet he couldn't deny it. Being near her, even under duress, felt necessary. Vital, even. Hours passed. The storm raged through the night, lightning illuminating the nursery in intermittent bursts, thunder rolling like distant drums. Leo and Rita moved in careful rhythm around each other, working side by side, sharing glances, gestures, and unspoken acknowledgement of their mutual focus. They didn't speak much, but the silence carried weight, a charged tension that neither could fully articulate. At one point, a monitor beeped irregularly. Both rushed to the incubator, hands nearly touching as they adjusted the settings. Leo caught her gaze, eyes wide, and for a brief moment, the tension broke, not with words, but with understanding. They were aligned, their actions synchronized, and in that brief alignment, a fragile trust formed. "Good," Rita murmured, giving him a faint, approving nod. "See? You're learning to trust me." Leo's lips twitched in the shadow of a smirk. "Don't push it," he muttered, though the hardness in his tone had softened. The storm outside no longer felt like a threat. It was just a backdrop to the tension and connection within these walls. By midnight, the storm had begun to subside. Rain dripped steadily from the eaves, and the wind eased into a whisper. Leo leaned back in his chair for the first time all evening, exhaustion finally settling over him. He allowed himself a fleeting glance at Rita, still tending to the smallest infant. Her movements were precise, calm, and imbued with a quiet strength he couldn't ignore. "You know," he said softly, voice low, almost hesitant, "I never thought I'd allow someone else this close. Not in my world." Rita paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. "Maybe your world isn't just about control," she said gently. "Sometimes, letting someone in is what saves everyone." Leo felt the weight of her words, a gentle pressure against the walls he had built for decades. He wanted to argue, to retreat, to push back, but he didn't. He couldn't. Not when the fragile lives around them depended on cooperation, trust, and the willingness to allow someone else in. For the rest of the night, they remained in the nursery, moving with careful coordination, a quiet rhythm forming between them. They were bound together not by choice, but by necessity. And in that forced proximity, something began to shift. A subtle acknowledgement that neither could fully articulate. Fear was easing, trust was forming, and the spark of something more was growing in the spaces between them. By dawn, the storm had passed entirely. Golden sunlight filtered through the rain-soaked windows, illuminating the nursery in soft, warm light. Leo and Rita stood side by side, exhaustion written across their faces, yet a quiet satisfaction lingered in the room. They had weathered the night, protected the babies, and without words, begun to dismantle the barriers that had kept them apart. Leo inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the past hours settle over him. He still resisted fully opening his heart, still clung to control. Yet he couldn't deny the subtle pull of connection. The realization that proximity could bring more than discomfort. It could bring understanding, trust, and even the beginnings of something dangerously close to affection. Rita, for her part, sensed it too. The walls weren't gone. They wouldn't be for a long time, but the storm had forced them together, and in that togetherness, something vital had formed. A fragile, unspoken bond that neither could ignore. And in that quiet morning light, both understood that proximity, forced by circumstance, driven by necessity, was transforming the way they saw each other. Fear, resistance, pride, they still lingered. But so did something else. The faint, undeniable spark of connection, growing stronger with each shared heartbeat, each silent gesture, and each fleeting glance. In that moment, the nursery felt alive, not just with the fragile breaths of the quadruplets, but with the unspoken promise of possibility. Leo and Rita, bound together by circumstance, were beginning to see that forced proximity could be more than a test. It could be the start of something neither expected, something neither could deny. The storm had rolled in unexpectedly that evening, fierce and unrelenting. Rain lashed against the mansion's expansive windows, turning the gardens outside into a blur of gray shadows. Leo McPherson was pacing, tense and impatient. The staff had retreated to secure the estate, leaving only him, Rita, and the 4 fragile lives that had become his sole obsession. Rita moved quietly between the incubators, checking monitors, adjusting tiny blankets, and murmuring soft encouragements to each baby. Leo's eyes followed her, a mixture of irritation and reluctant admiration battling in his chest. He wanted to assert control, to tell her to step back, to let him manage. But the sudden storm, the isolation of the mansion, and the weight of responsibility left him powerless. He had no choice but to remain near her, trapped together in the nursery. "You shouldn't be out in this storm," he said finally, his voice low but tense. He didn't meet her eyes, focusing instead on the baby's monitors. "It's dangerous." Rita glanced up, her expression calm yet firm. "I need to be here. They can't wait for anyone else." Her hands moved confidently, adjusting a tiny oxygen mask. "Besides, I've faced worse than a storm. You of all people should know that sometimes circumstances force us to act, even if it's inconvenient." Leo clenched his jaw. She had a point, of course. He did know. He had faced financial crises that could have destroyed empires, and survived betrayals that could have shattered him. Yet this felt different. Vulnerability wasn't just a possibility here. It was mandatory. He couldn't retreat into the walls of his office, couldn't hide behind money or influence. He was forced to be present, forced to watch, forced to acknowledge something he had long denied. His need for connection, for help, for trust. Minutes passed in tense silence. The storm outside intensified, wind rattling the panes, thunder rolling across the hills surrounding the estate. Inside, the nursery was warm and still. The only sound the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the quiet murmur of Rita speaking to the babies. Leo's chest tightened. He hated feeling exposed, hated the way her calm confidence unsettled him. Yet he couldn't tear his gaze from her. Rita noticed his tension but didn't comment. She understood the delicate balance of pride and fear, the invisible walls he had built around himself. She moved closer to him, adjusting a blanket over the smallest infant without asking permission. An act that would have been impossible if he hadn't been forced to remain silent, forced to accept her presence. "Leo," she said softly, not looking at him. "They're stable for now. But you can't do this alone." His lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't respond immediately, letting silence stretch between them. But something in her tone, gentle yet unwavering, struck a chord deep within him. He was used to commanding every situation, used to being in control. Yet here, with the storm raging outside and the weight of the infants' lives pressing down, he had no choice but to listen, to observe, to trust, even if only slightly. The first lightning bolt split the sky, illuminating the nursery in stark, white brilliance. Leo flinched involuntarily, and Rita's hand brushed his shoulder as she adjusted the tiny incubator. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent a jolt through him. A reminder that proximity was no longer optional. They were tethered together, not just by the crisis, but by circumstance. You're impossible," he muttered, voice low, almost a whisper. His pride demanded that he assert dominance, that he push her away. Yet there was something else in his words, unspoken and raw. Admiration, relief, and a hint of something more dangerous, attraction. Rita didn't flinch. "Maybe," she replied softly. "But I think we make a good team when it matters most. You should try it sometime." Her words, light and teasing, were a subtle challenge. Leo felt his defenses shift slowly, almost imperceptibly. He hated the warmth that crept into his chest, hated the way her presence made the world outside the nursery fade into insignificance. And yet he couldn't deny it. Being near her, even under duress, felt necessary. Vital, even. Hours passed. The storm raged through the night, lightning illuminating the nursery in intermittent bursts, thunder rolling like distant drums. Leo and Rita moved in careful rhythm around each other, working side by side, sharing glances, gestures, and unspoken acknowledgement of their mutual focus. They didn't speak much, but the silence carried weight, a charged tension that neither could fully articulate. At one point, a monitor beeped irregularly. Both rushed to the incubator, hands nearly touching as they adjusted the settings. Leo caught her gaze, eyes wide, and for a brief moment the tension broke, not with words but with understanding. They were aligned, their actions synchronized, and in that brief alignment, a fragile trust formed. "Good," Rita murmured, giving him a faint, approving nod. "See? You're learning to trust me." Leo's lips twitched in the shadow of a smirk. "Don't push it," he muttered, though the hardness in his tone had softened. The storm outside no longer felt like a threat. It was just a backdrop to the tension and connection within these walls. By midnight, the storm had begun to subside. Rain dripped steadily from the eaves, and the wind eased into a whisper. Leo leaned back in his chair for the first time all evening, exhaustion finally settling over him. He allowed himself a fleeting glance at Rita, still tending to the smallest infant. Her movements were precise, calm, and imbued with a quiet strength he couldn't ignore. "You know," he said softly, voice low, almost hesitant, "I never thought I'd allow someone else this close. Not in my world." Rita paused, glancing at him over her shoulder. "Maybe your world isn't just about control," she said gently. "Sometimes, letting someone in is what saves everyone." Leo felt the weight of her words, a gentle pressure against the walls he had built for decades. He wanted to argue, to retreat, to push back, but he didn't. He couldn't. Not when the fragile lives around them depended on cooperation, trust, and the willingness to allow someone else in. For the rest of the night, they remained in the nursery, moving with careful coordination, a quiet rhythm forming between them. They were bound together not by choice, but by necessity. And in that forced proximity, something began to shift. A subtle acknowledgement that neither could fully articulate. Fear was easing, trust was forming, and the spark of something more was growing in the spaces between them. By dawn, the storm had passed entirely. Golden sunlight filtered through the rain-soaked windows, illuminating the nursery in soft, warm light. Leo and Rita stood side by side, exhaustion written across their faces, yet a quiet satisfaction lingered in the room. They had weathered the night, protected the babies, and without words, begun to dismantle the barriers that had kept them apart. Leo inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the past hours settle over him. He still resisted fully opening his heart, still clung to control. Yet he couldn't deny the subtle pull of connection. The realization that proximity could bring more than discomfort. It could bring understanding, trust, and even the beginnings of something dangerously close to affection. Rita, for her part, sensed it too. The walls weren't gone. They wouldn't be for a long time. But the storm had forced them together, and in that togetherness, something vital had formed. A fragile, unspoken bond that neither could ignore. And in that quiet morning light, both understood that proximity, forced by circumstance, driven by necessity, was transforming the way they saw each other. Fear, resistance, pride, they still lingered. But so did something else. The faint, undeniable spark of connection, growing stronger with each shared heartbeat, each silent gesture, and each fleeting glance. In that moment, the nursery felt alive, not just with the fragile breaths of the quadruplets, but with the unspoken promise of possibility. Leo and Rita, bound together by circumstance, were beginning to see that forced proximity could be more than a test. It could be the start of something neither expected, something neither could deny. The following morning, sunlight streamed softly through the nursery windows, catching specks of dust that danced like tiny stars in the air. The quadruplets were stable, their rhythmic breaths a fragile symphony of life, but the emotional atmosphere between Leo and Rita had shifted. The storm from the night before had done more than force proximity. It had cracked a layer of resistance, revealing an opening for understanding, though neither knew how deep it would go. Leo was seated in his usual corner, arms crossed, jaw tight. He observed Rita as she moved with quiet efficiency between the incubators. Her calm was both infuriating and magnetic, a stark contrast to the chaos that roiled inside him. For the first time, he considered the possibility that she was not just competent, not just brave, but someone who could penetrate the walls he had built over decades. That thought alone was terrifying. Rita, sensing the fragile tension, approached him carefully, balancing a clipboard in one hand. She had noticed the small tremor in his hands last night when he nearly intervened in the incubator adjustments. It wasn't fear, she had seen plenty of that, but a mixture of something heavier, grief, regret, and the burden of unspoken responsibility. Leo, she began softly, I think it's time you told me about your past, about what made you so guarded. You can't keep carrying everything alone, not even with all your wealth. Leo stiffened. His instinct was to shut her down, to claim control, to assert that his past was no one's business. But the look in her eyes, the calm, unwavering empathy, made him pause. He had spent years building walls of pride and authority. Yet here was someone not just daring to see past them, but gently asking him to open up. He started, voice low, uncertain. He cleared his throat, running a hand through his hair. I've never liked talking about my childhood, or my mistakes, or the things I've lost. Rita nodded, encouraging but patient. I'm not asking you to unload everything at once. Just start somewhere. Let me understand you. Let me help. A tense silence stretched between them. Leo's eyes wandered to the monitors, to the delicate fingers of the babies, before settling on Rita. The honesty in her request struck a chord. For the first time, he felt the weight of isolation he had carried for years, not just as a billionaire, not just as a father, but as a man who had never allowed himself to be vulnerable. He exhaled, long and deliberate, then finally spoke. When I was 12, my father, he left. No explanation. Just gone. My mother tried, but she had her own battles. I was left to fend for myself, to navigate the world with no guidance, no support. I learned to control everything because if I didn't, everything would collapse. Rita listened quietly, giving him the space to continue, her presence steady, non-judgmental. Leo's voice cracked slightly as he continued, revealing more than he had intended. By the time I was 16, I was running small ventures, learning to manipulate outcomes, manage risks. I became successful because I had no choice. But along the way, I learned to trust no one. Attachment was weakness. Emotion was weakness. The words hung heavy in the room, but Rita didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, a gentle hand brushing the edge of an incubator, grounding herself in the present. Leo, she said softly, your past shaped you, yes. But it doesn't have to define you now. You can choose differently. He shook his head, the old instinct to resist roaring back. You don't understand. I've made enemies, lost people who mattered, betrayed and been betrayed. Trusting someone is a gamble I can't afford. Not even for this. He gestured vaguely toward the quadruplets. Rita's expression softened, but she didn't back down. And yet here you are, watching me work with them. Watching me care. You're already taking a gamble, whether you admit it or not. You can fight it, or you can accept that maybe. You don't have to do it alone. For the first time, Leo considered that she was right. He had been so focused on control, on armor, on self-reliance, that he hadn't allowed himself to see the possibility of shared responsibility, or shared healing. The realization was frightening, but also liberating. The moment of vulnerability broke further when Rita shared a fragment of her own story. I wasn't born into privilege, she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. I grew up with very little. I lost my father early and my mother. She worked herself to exhaustion just to keep food on the table. I learned to take responsibility for others, to be resilient, and to survive. But I also learned the value of connection, of trust. I didn't have the luxury of wealth, but I had to rely on people who truly cared. And that's how I learned to be strong. Leo's gaze softened. He hadn't expected her to open up so willingly, to offer pieces of herself so raw and real. It made his walls wobble, subtly but unmistakably. The storm inside him, the fear, the resistance, was being challenged by her courage, by her honesty, by her refusal to be intimidated by his pride. As the day wore on, the past unfolded further. Leo revealed how early business successes had been fueled by fear and a relentless drive to never be vulnerable again. He spoke of betrayal in the corporate world, of allies who turned enemies overnight. And Rita, in turn, spoke of sacrifices, of loss, and of the moments when she had risked everything to protect those she loved. Each revelation, each fragment of truth, was a layer stripped away, allowing trust and understanding to seep in. By mid-afternoon, the nursery felt transformed. The quadruplets, oblivious to the adult conflicts surrounding them, slept peacefully. The air between Leo and Rita was charged with a new intensity, a fragile, tentative connection grounded in shared vulnerability. Leo's defenses were still present, but they had cracks now, cracks that allowed light, understanding, and perhaps even affection to filter through. You see, Rita said softly, almost rhetorically, we're not so different. We've both had to survive, to be strong. But strength doesn't mean isolation. Strength means knowing when to trust, when to allow someone else to carry part of the burden. Leo absorbed her words, feeling an unfamiliar sensation in his chest. Hope. He still had walls, still had fear, but for the first time, he considered the possibility that he could allow someone in, someone like Rita, to be part of his world, to share responsibility for his children, and perhaps to share his heart. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting golden light across the room, a quiet understanding settled between them. They didn't need to speak further. The truth of their backstories, the revelations of their past pains, had forged a subtle bond. Trust, fragile and tentative, had begun to grow, and with it, a tentative hope that connection, love, and healing were possible. Even for someone as guarded as Leo McPherson. And for Rita, the acknowledgement that Leo could open, even just a fraction, was enough. She knew the road ahead would be challenging, that his resistance would flare again, and that their bond was still delicate. But she also knew that shared truths had power. Shared vulnerability had the ability to transform even the most fortified hearts. As they stood side by side, the quadruplets resting safely, The weight of past and present merged. Leo realized that this forced exposure, this backstory unveiled, was not weakness. It was the first step toward trust, toward connection, toward the possibility of love. And Rita, ever patient, understood that sometimes, revealing the past was the only way to build a future. The afternoon sun bathed the nursery in a warm, golden glow. The storm had passed, leaving behind the sweet scent of rain on the earth outside, and a sense of fragile calm inside. The quadruplets slept in synchronized silence, their tiny chests rising and falling like a shared rhythm, while Leo and Rita moved around them with careful, deliberate movements. There was a new ease in the air, subtle but undeniable. Leo had settled into a chair, his eyes on the smallest infant. He watched the child's tiny hands curl and uncurl, marveling at the sheer fragility of life. He had been a man accustomed to controlling outcomes, managing crises and building empires, but here, surrounded by the innocence and vulnerability of these four tiny lives, he felt powerless in the most profound way. And yet, for the first time, he didn't mind. Rita moved beside him, carrying a small bottle of warm milk. She glanced at him, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You're not used to being gentle with things so small, are you?" she asked teasingly. Leo's lips twitched in the shadow of a grin. "Gentle? I'm not sure I know how." She laughed quietly, a melodic sound that filled the room without disturbing the babies. "Then let me show you." She handed him the bottle, guiding his hands around the tiny infant's grasp. "See? Start by letting them feel your presence, your warmth. They need to trust you." Leo followed her instructions, awkward at first, then with more confidence as he felt the baby's tiny fingers curl around his. The sensation was electric in a strange, grounding way. He looked up at Rita, noticing the way her eyes softened, her patience radiating without effort. There was no judgment, no expectation, just trust, quiet and steady. "You're learning fast," she said, her voice low, almost intimate. "I think you might actually enjoy this." He shook his head, but a laugh escaped him. A sound he hadn't made in years that felt honest and light. "Don't get used to it," he said, though the tension in his shoulders had eased. They worked side by side, alternating bottles, adjusting blankets, and whispering tiny reassurances. It was a delicate dance, an unspoken rhythm that required attention, patience, and trust. And as they moved together, the walls between them continued to crumble. Imperceptibly but inexorably. After a while, Leo leaned back, letting out a long breath. "You know," he said quietly, "I've spent my entire life trying to control everything. People, outcomes, even my own emotions. And here I am completely powerless over something that matters more than anything else." Rita met his gaze, her eyes calm and steady. "That's because you're finally allowing yourself to feel," she said softly. "To let someone else in. To share the responsibility, the care. That's strength, Leo, not control." He blinked, absorbing her words, letting them sink in. For so long he had equated power with safety, control with security. And yet, in the quiet of the nursery, with the warm weight of a sleeping infant in his arms and Rita's steady presence beside him, he realized that strength could take another form. One that involved vulnerability, trust, and connection. They paused for a moment, watching the babies sleep. The silence between them was not awkward, but full of unspoken understanding. Leo felt an unfamiliar warmth, a sense of peace he hadn't known he was capable of feeling. Rita, too, felt the subtle shift, sensing that their bond was no longer just about necessity or circumstance. Something deeper, more fragile, was emerging. "You know," Rita said softly, "you don't have to be perfect. None of us are. Sometimes just being present, just caring, is enough." Leo smiled faintly, a mixture of appreciation and something else, something he wasn't ready to name. "I'm not sure I know how to do anything except be calculated," he admitted. "But with you it feels different. Right? Safe." Her smile widened slightly, though she kept her tone light. "That's good. Because safe is exactly what they need. And maybe what you need too." He looked at her then, really looked, taking in the quiet strength, the patience, the warmth. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to hide behind arrogance or control. He simply allowed himself to be seen, in small ways, in the gentle moments between bottles and blankets. Hours passed. marked not by clocks but by tiny milestones. A coo, a smile, a hand grasping another. And in those simple acts, Leo felt an unspoken bond growing, not just with the infants but with Rita. Her presence was no longer an intrusion. It was a comfort, a steadying force, a reminder that he didn't have to face life alone. At one point, Rita laughed softly as one of the babies made a tiny, triumphant squeak after grasping her finger. Leo looked at her, intrigued by the light in her eyes. "You really love this, don't you?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. "I do," she admitted. "I love helping. I love protecting. And I like seeing you discover this side of yourself." He hesitated, then allowed a small grin. "I never thought I'd enjoy this," he said, gesturing to the sleeping infants. "But I think I do. With guidance." Rita chuckled quietly, offering him a playful, conspiratorial glance. "See? Progress." The day wore on, and exhaustion began to settle in. Yet neither Leo nor Rita minded. The shared effort, the trust, the quiet laughter and gentle interactions had created something rare. A moment of genuine connection. They were no longer simply caretaker and employer, guardian and stranger. They were partners in responsibility, in vulnerability, in healing. As evening approached, Leo and Rita sat side by side, watching the sun dip below the horizon, casting a warm, amber glow across the nursery. The quadruplets slept peacefully, their tiny breaths steady. The air between them was calm, charged with unspoken emotion. "You know," Leo said quietly, breaking the silence, "I never expected to feel this connected or hopeful." Rita placed a gentle hand on his arm, a grounding, reassuring touch. "It's okay," she said softly. "You're allowed to feel it. And you're allowed to let it grow." He met her gaze, seeing in her eyes the same recognition he felt in his own heart. Something tender, fragile, and real was taking root. The walls were still there, of course. They would take time to fully dismantle. But for the first time, Leo understood that opening up, trusting, and bonding could be as much a source of strength as control had ever been. And in that moment, as the sunlight softened and the room settled into quiet harmony, Leo and Rita allowed themselves to imagine a future. Not just for the quadruplets, but for themselves. A future where connection, trust, and even love might be possible. It was a small, fragile hope, but it was enough. The day had begun like any other. The nursery bathed in soft morning light. The quadruplets were stable, their tiny cries mingling with the gentle hum of monitors. Leo and Rita moved around them with a quiet rhythm, their bond growing, trust deepening, and subtle smiles beginning to break through the walls that had long protected Leo's heart. But the fragile piece was about to shatter. Leo had just finished adjusting a blanket over one of the twins when his phone buzzed urgently on the side table. He frowned, glancing at the screen. The name flashing across the display made his blood run cold. It was a rival business partner, someone he had spent years outmaneuvering, someone who had a history of exploiting his vulnerabilities. The message was short, but the implications were devastating. "I know what you've been hiding. If you don't act, you'll lose everything." Rita noticed the sudden tension in his posture, the tight line of his jaw, the way his hands trembled slightly as he typed a response. "Leo, what's wrong?" she asked softly, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he swiped the message away, his mind racing. The quadruplets were safe for now, but the threat outside this room was real, imminent, and personal. "I need to deal with this," he finally muttered, a hard edge in his voice. "It's complicated." Rita's brows furrowed. She had come to trust him, to see the man behind the billionaire armor, and she sensed the shift, the sudden coldness that edged his tone, the abrupt barrier rising between them. "Leo, you don't have to do this alone," she said, her voice calm but insistent. "I said I'll handle it," he snapped, sharper than intended. The words hit the room with unintended force, echoing against the walls of fragile trust. Rita flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, she chose her words carefully, her gaze steady. "You don't have to shut me out to protect them, or yourself." Leo's chest tightened. He wanted to believe her, wanted to let her in, but the fear of vulnerability and betrayal surged. He turned away, gripping the edge of a counter. "This isn't about you," he said, though even he knew the lie hung between them. "You wouldn't understand." Rita's lips pressed into a thin line. She had seen this before, walls rising, doors slamming shut, the familiar armor of a man who had been hurt too many times. But she also knew that leaving it unchallenged would allow distance to grow into irreparable separation. Then help me understand, she said quietly. Because I'm not going anywhere. Before Leo could respond, another complication struck. One of the babies began to cry violently, a high-pitched wail that pierced the fragile calm. Rita moved instantly to soothe the child, lifting it gently and whispering reassurances. Leo reached out to assist, but the frustration and fear boiling inside him spilled over. He snapped at Rita, sharper than he had intended. Step back. Let me handle it. Rita's hands froze midair. Her eyes widened, hurt flashing across her face. Leo, that's not how we work together, she said, her voice trembling slightly with indignation and sorrow. We're supposed to be a team. The words hung heavy. For a moment, the room seemed suspended in tension. Leo's chest heaved. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but the fear of losing control, of being vulnerable, overpowered reason. I said I've got this, he muttered, turning fully away. Rita shook her head, stepping back from him and from the baby, which had quieted slightly in her arms. No, Leo. This isn't just about the babies. It's about us. And right now, I don't recognize you. Her words struck like a blow. Leo's hands clenched into fists, jaw tight. He didn't realize until that moment how much he had relied on her, how much trust he had placed in her presence. And now, his fear, pride, and the intrusion of outside threats were unraveling everything he had started to build with her. The nursery, once a place of gentle bonding and tentative love, now felt suffocating. Each breath was heavy with tension, each glance sharp with unspoken accusation. Leo paced, running a hand through his hair, trying to calm the storm inside him. Rita, standing with her arms crossed, refused to move, refusing to back down even as her heart ached at the sudden distance between them. You think I'm weak? Leo finally snapped, the words spilling out in a mix of anger and fear. You think I can't handle this alone? I don't think that, Rita replied, her voice steady but firm. I think you're shutting me out. And if this is how you react when things get hard, maybe I can't trust you either. The accusation hit harder than any external threat ever could. Leo froze, the weight of her words sinking in. He wanted to argue, to justify, to protect himself with his usual armor, but deep down he knew the truth. He had let fear dictate his actions, had allowed his walls to crush the fragile bond forming between them. A tense silence filled the room. The quadruplets stirred slightly, sensing the emotional storm surrounding them. Leo's chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, his hands trembling despite his attempts at control. Rita's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, a mix of frustration, sorrow, and the faintest glimmer of hope that he might reach out. Though at this moment, it seemed impossible. Finally, Leo turned away, shoulders slumping in exhaustion. He couldn't bring himself to speak. The words lodged in his throat, choked by pride, fear, and regret. Rita, seeing the momentary collapse of his facade, felt a pang of sorrow but also clarity. She knew the bond they had forged was fragile, and right now, it had fractured. Without another word, Rita gently placed the baby back into its incubator, straightened the blankets, and stepped toward the door. I need some air, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper, but firm in its resolve. We both do. Leo remained where he was, staring at the monitors, his mind racing. He wanted to call her back, to explain, to apologize, but fear and pride warred within him. The external threat from his rival loomed large, a reminder that the world outside this room demanded vigilance, control, and strength. And yet, in the quiet aftermath of their argument, he realized that he had nearly lost something far more valuable: trust, connection, and the fragile possibility of love. As Rita left, the room seemed colder, emptier. The quadruplets slept on, oblivious to the storm that had erupted around them. Leo sank into his chair, head in his hands, heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. He understood, with painful clarity, that his inability to balance fear, control, and vulnerability had pushed away the one person who had begun to bridge the gap between his isolated world and the possibility of love. Hours passed, the golden light fading to amber, then to deep twilight. Leo remained in the nursery, silently watching over the quadruplets. Every tiny movement, every breath, reminded him of what he had at stake, but also of what he had nearly destroyed. The shatter point was clear. The bond with Rita, the trust they had nurtured, was fractured. And unless he acted, unless he chose vulnerability over pride, he risked losing her forever. Outside, Rita walked through the mansion's gardens, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She replayed every word, every gesture, every sharp edge in Leo's tone. She understood the pressures he carried, the walls he had built over a lifetime, but her heart ached at the emotional distance that had suddenly formed. She realized that love, fragile and tentative, required not just care and patience, but courage to face conflict without retreat. As night settled, the nursery stood in quiet, tense anticipation. The quadruplets slept, unaware of the emotional storm, while Leo sat in a rare, unguarded state of reflection. He had been forced to confront his flaws. The pride, the fear, the inability to trust, and the emotional cost was real. The shatter point was not just a rupture between two people. It was a mirror, reflecting every barrier he had built to protect himself, every missed opportunity for connection. And in the silence, one thought echoed relentlessly. If he didn't act, if he didn't choose vulnerability over fear, he would not only lose Rita, he would lose the chance to experience love, unexpected, transformative and real, for the first time in his life. Night had fallen over the mansion, and a heavy silence hung in the nursery. The quadruplets slept peacefully, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm, unaware of the emotional storm that had shaken the room hours earlier. Leo sat alone in his chair, head resting in his hands, mind racing with the aftermath of his confrontation with Rita. Every word, every sharp tone, every unspoken thought replayed endlessly in his mind. The weight of regret pressed down on him. He knew, with a clarity that was almost painful, that he had let fear dictate his actions. His pride, his insistence on control, had created a chasm between him and the one person who had begun to breach the walls of his heart. And now the question loomed. Would he allow that chasm to remain, or would he dare to cross it, to risk vulnerability and perhaps redemption? Meanwhile, Rita walked slowly through the mansion's garden, the night air cool against her skin. She paused near the fountain, the soft trickle of water mingling with her thoughts. The argument with Leo had left her shaken but also resolute. She knew that love, fragile and unexpected as it was, demanded courage. It demanded the willingness to face emotional pain and extend trust even when it could be broken. And yet, she felt the pull of her own pride. The fear that if she reached out first, she might be rejected again. Back in the nursery, Leo rose from his chair and paced the floor. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling the tension knotting in his shoulders. He thought of Rita's eyes, firm yet filled with unspoken care, and the way she had refused to back down even in the face of his anger. He remembered her touch, her warmth, and the laughter they had shared hours ago. Every memory felt like a thread connecting him to something he had nearly lost forever. He stopped by the window, looking out at the moonlight reflecting off the fountain where Rita had been standing moments ago. His heart tightened. For so long, he had believed that love was a distraction, a weakness. But now he realized it was something more. It was a force that could heal, that could challenge him to be better, that could offer meaning beyond wealth and power. Meanwhile, Rita's mind wandered to the same thoughts, unknowingly mirroring his. She questioned whether she could bridge the distance between them, whether Leo would allow himself to be vulnerable, whether their fragile bond could survive his fear and pride. The garden seemed both vast and confining, echoing the emotional distance that had grown between them. Leo made a decision. He would not let pride dictate his choices. He would confront the fear, face the vulnerability, and reach out. The stakes were too high. The quadruplets needed them both, and he needed her. Steeling himself, he moved toward the door, pausing for a moment to gather courage. His voice, barely above a whisper, echoed into the empty hallway. Rita! Rita, who had been leaning against the fountain, stiffened at the sound of her name. She turned slowly, hope and uncertainty warring within her. Leo appeared at the garden entrance, silhouetted by the soft glow of the moon. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic gesture, just the raw, unfiltered presence of a man choosing to risk everything for connection. He stepped closer, hands slightly trembling, eyes searching hers. He began but stopped, struggling to find words that could convey the depth of his regret and longing. I was wrong, he finally said, voice low but sincere. I let fear, let pride get in the way. I shouldn't have shouted. I shouldn't have shut you out. Rita's eyes glistened with emotion, her own breath catching in her throat. She had heard apologies before, empty ones delivered without intent. But this was different. This was the vulnerable, unguarded Leo, the man who had finally acknowledged his own flaws, and was willing to expose them to her. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft murmur of the fountain. I know it wasn't just about the babies. It was about us, about trust. He nodded, taking a tentative step closer. I want to trust you. I want us to try. But I need you to know, I can't do it alone. I need your patience. I need your guidance. And I need your forgiveness. Rita's lips trembled in a small, almost imperceptible smile. I can give you that, she said softly, her hand reaching out toward his. But only if you're truly willing to let go of your fear, to let me in fully. Leo took her hand in his, feeling the warmth, the steadiness, the quiet strength that had drawn him to her from the beginning. He knew the path forward would not be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, external pressures threatening to undo their fragile bond. But for the first time in years, he felt something real. A connection that went beyond control, beyond pride, beyond fear. They stood there, hand in hand, the night around them silent but full of possibility. The quadruplets' future, their shared responsibilities, and their own hearts seemed to converge in this quiet, decisive moment. Leo realized that choosing vulnerability did not make him weak, it made him human. And in that humanity lay the chance for true love. Unexpected and transformative. Rita's thumb brushed gently against the back of his hand, a simple gesture laden with meaning. We can face anything together, she said quietly. But it has to start with us, honest, open, and willing to risk it all. Leo nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink in. He let go of the last traces of fear, the last fragments of pride, and allowed himself to be fully present. I'm ready, he said, voice steady, filled with resolve. I choose us. I choose love. Tears welled in Rita's eyes, but this time they were not of frustration or sorrow. They were of relief, hope, and the quiet triumph of hearts willing to risk everything. She stepped closer, closing the distance between them, and pressed her forehead gently against his. The gesture, simple and intimate, conveyed what words could not. Forgiveness, acceptance, and the possibility of a shared future. They stayed there for a long moment, holding each other, the night around them deepening the intimacy of the scene. No grand declarations were necessary. The silence itself was enough. The choice had been made. Vulnerability had won over pride, trust had triumphed over fear, and love, unexpected, fragile, and transformative, was given a chance to flourish. As they finally stepped back, still holding hands, Leo's eyes flicked toward the nursery. The quadruplets slept on, their tiny lives a silent testament to the stakes of the choices they had made. The path ahead would be challenging, filled with responsibilities and uncertainties, but together they were stronger. The shatter point had passed, and now at last, they could begin to rebuild, not just the trust between them, but the possibility of a family forged by love, resilience, and courage. In the quiet of the night, Leo whispered almost to himself, "We'll make it right. We'll make it together." Rita smiled softly, squeezing his hand. Yes, together. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the weight of fear, pride, and isolation lifted, replaced by the fragile, luminous hope of love at last. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the nursery, casting warm golden light over the sleeping quadruplets. The soft beeping of monitors filled the air with a steady, reassuring rhythm, a heartbeat that mirrored the newfound harmony in the mansion. Leo moved carefully among the incubators, his fingers brushing the delicate hands of his babies. For the first time in weeks, he felt a calm that was deeper than relief. It was a quiet joy rooted in the choices he had made, in the vulnerability he had embraced. Rita entered quietly, carrying a tray of breakfast for them both. She paused at the doorway, observing him with a smile that was gentle, knowing, and full of unspoken love. Leo turned, his expression softening as soon as he met her eyes. There was no tension, no lingering distance. Only the delicate, steady warmth of two hearts that had chosen to rebuild together. "Good morning," she said softly, setting the tray down on the side table. "Good morning," Leo replied, his voice calm, almost tender. He stepped closer, taking her hand in his, feeling the comfort and reassurance that had seemed so fragile only the night before. They stood for a moment in silence, their fingers intertwined, a quiet acknowledgement of the storm they had weathered. Leo's mind drifted back to the previous night, to the shatter point that had threatened to break everything. The memory was sharp, but it no longer carried the weight of fear or regret. It was a reminder of how far they had come, of the courage and vulnerability that had allowed them to survive that emotional rupture. I want to thank you," Leo said finally, his voice low and sincere. "For not walking away. For believing in us, even when I made it so difficult." Rita squeezed his hand gently. "I didn't walk away because I saw the man you could be, not just the walls you've built. And I believe in love that's real, even if it scares us." Leo smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips that spoke volumes of relief and affection. "Real love, it's hard," he admitted. "But it's worth every risk." Rita's eyes shimmered, reflecting both pride and tenderness. "And it's what we have to fight for every day," she said. "Not just for us, but for them too." She nodded toward the quadruplets, their tiny forms curled in peaceful sleep. The room was filled with a soft serenity, punctuated only by the occasional coo or stretch of the babies. Leo gently picked up one of them, holding the small body close to his chest. He marveled at the fragility and perfection of life, at the trust and dependence of these tiny beings. And he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond wealth, status, or control. Rita moved closer, watching him cradle the baby, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You're amazing with them," she whispered, her voice full of warmth and admiration. Leo's gaze met hers, gratitude and affection intertwining. "I couldn't do it without you," he said honestly. "You've taught me how to love beyond fear, how to trust beyond pride." There was a brief pause, a stillness that held the weight of everything they had endured. The conflict, the fear, the shatter point, and now the quiet joy of reunion. Leo lowered the baby back into its crib, adjusting the blankets carefully, and turned fully to Rita. "I want to make this official," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Not just for us, but for our family. I want to build a life with you, with them, with all of us together." Rita's eyes glistened with tears of happiness, and she took a step closer, her hands finding his. "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, Leo. Let's do this together." The moment was simple, yet profoundly intimate. No extravagant gestures, no grandiose declarations, just the unspoken promise of commitment, of love earned through trials and tests, of a bond stronger for having been broken and rebuilt. Later that morning, they sat together, feeding the babies side by side. The room was alive with small sounds, tiny coos, soft laughter, the gentle hum of monitors, but it was not noise, it was music to their hearts. Every smile, every gurgle, every reaching hand was a reminder of what had been at stake, and what they now had to protect and cherish. Leo looked at Rita, their eyes locking across the soft glow of the morning sun. "Do you remember," he asked softly, "the first time we met in this nursery?" Rita laughed quietly, the sound full of warmth and light. "I remember," she said. "You were so stubborn, so determined to handle everything alone. And I thought, this man needs saving, whether he knows it or not." Leo chuckled, shaking his head. "And now look at us. Saved not by money, not by power, but by something neither of us expected." "Love," Rita whispered, leaning her head gently on his shoulder. "Yes," Leo said, wrapping an arm around her. "Love at last, unexpected, but perfect." For a long moment, they sat there in the quiet embrace of the morning, the quadruplets resting peacefully, the mansion around them alive with soft sunlight and gentle shadows. The past struggles, the conflicts, the moments of fear and anger, they all felt like distant echoes, reminders of how fragile yet resilient love could be. Leo pressed a soft kiss to Rita's forehead. "We'll keep building this," he said, his voice full of certainty. "Every day, every moment, together." "And we will," Rita replied, smiling through her tears. For us, for them, for everything we've survived. The quadruplets stirred slightly, their tiny hands reaching, as if sensing the renewed harmony and love in the room. Leo gently lifted them one by one, holding each close, while Rita moved beside him, their hands brushing, their hearts synchronized. It was a tableau of family, connection, and the triumph of love over fear. Outside, the morning sun shone brightly over the mansion, illuminating the garden, the fountain, the world that had once seemed so uncertain. Inside, Leo and Rita embraced their new reality, hearts full, eyes open to the beauty of the present and the promise of the future. They had faced the shatter point, made the choice, and now, finally, they were whole, together. As Leo looked down at the sleeping faces of his quadruplets, he whispered softly, almost to himself, "We made it, all of us." Rita smiled, pressing her cheek against his. "Yes, we did. And this is only the beginning." The day continued, filled with gentle laughter, tender care, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that love, unexpected, transformative, and enduring, had won at last. And in the soft morning light, Leo and Rita stood together, hands intertwined, hearts aligned, ready to face the world as a family united, unbroken, and infinitely stronger for every trial they had endured. The shatter point had passed. The choice had been made. The resolution was real. Love had triumphed. What part touched you the most? Write it in the comments section. Thank you so much for watching this story all the way to the end. Your time, your support, and your presence here mean more than words can say. If this story touched your heart, inspired you, or kept you watching, please make sure to subscribe to the channel for more emotional stories like this one. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss a new upload. Until next time, stay blessed, stay strong, and keep believing in love. See you in the next story.